Well, of course, our hobby is littered with, unfortunately, forgeries, fakes, and counterfeits, call them what you like. They have something which has plagued philately since its very early years. And you have an enormous amount of different types of fakes and different types of forgery, and there are also different intents on forgery. And in this talk, we're not going to necessarily talk about the physical fakes themselves, though we will touch upon them. But I thought what was rather more interesting were the stories and the reasons behind why someone may want to fake a stamp either for postage use, for philatelic use, or for propaganda as a tool of espionage. I found this quote on the internet which said that forgery was the world's second oldest profession, which I thought was rather telling, really. But we're not allowed to talk about the first one because it's not quite the watershed yet in the United Kingdom. And of course, to cover over what we just said, we're going to talk about the various different types of forgery, which I've classed into three sections. So we're going to discuss criminal forgeries, those who have the intent to forge stamps. And then we're going to talk about philatelic forgeries, which were not generally sold for postal purposes, but were generally sold to collectors and to dealers. And then lastly, we'll look at propaganda fakes. Prior to stamps, coinage, banknotes, and all manner of items have been faked since very much ancient times. Fakery is something which does plague our hobby. And whether you are a seasoned collector or a beginner, it's something we should all be aware of. Sorry, there we just had a slight glitch with the internet on that front. But first of all, I would like to look at criminal forgeries. So we're going to test on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about probably a very famous story about fake stamps that were used for a long period of time and were not actually seen and all discovered for about 20 years after the event happened. And that is, of course, the stock exchange forgeries of 1872. And of course, but before we do that, a little preamble. The primary reason to manufacture fake stamps and to distribute them for sale is to avoid the payment of postage and to profit from their sale. The cost of printing is relatively low and thus making a good markup and profit. And once they're sold, of course. This being an age-old problem, raw mail, which is battling them today, as we will also talk about later, even with its robust security checks and modern technologies, one of the most famous examples of fake stamps was, of course, the stock exchange forgeries. In 1870, private telegraphic companies were absorbed into the General Post Office and nationalised, with the London Exchange Office in the city of London being the busiest telegraph office in the country at the time. Sending a telegraph involved filling out a form and which contained your message, and you paid per letter or paid per word. And you would then take your completed form to the counter clerk, and in payment would be provided by the application of a postage stamp before telegraphic stamps were introduced for the sole purpose of this function. The basic charge for a telegram was £1 for 20 words and threepence for each word thereafter, and additional 5 words after that cost an extra threepence as well. Clerks at the stock exchange came up with a cunning plan. They forged the £1 green stamp, being the logical choice as £1 was the price for a basic telegram, and they applied them to the telegraphic forms which were handed to them at the London Exchange Office and pocketed the fee, at the same time not depleting their own stocks of £1 stamps, which had to be accounted for by the post office. Providing the crafty clerks were not too greedy, and only a small number of telegraphic messages could pass through quite easily with bearing the fake stamps. And once the message had been sent, the forms were bound up and stored before eventually being destroyed. The amount of time the stamps were available for examination and for scrutiny by London Exchange officials and indeed the post office was therefore relatively short. And this slide here is an example of a stock exchange forgery, one that appeared in our stock not too long ago. And we'll talk about the aspects of the fake and how they differ from the originals. The forgeries themselves are much cruder than the issued stamps by De La Rue, but were very sophisticated for the time. They forged 2 plates of the shilling green, plate 5 and plate 6, on unwatermarked paper, and they were perforated. There was no watermark on the paper. Plate 6 forgeries are a bit better because they had interchangeable letters. And of course, on the Great Britain stamps at the time, they had letters in all four corners to denote which position they were on the sheet. And what they did was, is because they knew that the letters were changed across and interchangeable, and you had so many in a sheet and you could point each one, they made it for plate 6 so they could take out the letters and put their own in, and thus being interchangeable. But the thing was, they only came in panes of 20 in each time, as opposed to 240 per sheet for the penny and most other values, and hence why you get impossible letterings. And this example here in our stock is lettered SB, and that is an impossible lettering for that particular issue. These forgeries went undiscovered for many years until 1898, so over 20 years after they had been used, when a young Charles Nissen, or Chas Nissen as he was generally known, found these crude 1-shilling telegraphs on the telegraph forms. The perpetrators were never discovered, and they're never brought to justice. And we can only surmise who they might have been, and interviews were done much later, say in the 1910s, but again, no convictions were ever made on discovering on who had done this very elaborate forging system. Examples of stock exchange forgeries are scarce, but they do occasionally appear on the market in our own retail stock and indeed in auction. And they are popular among collectors and who revel in the story of how successful these forgeries are. Often you'll see them just on their own with the stock exchange postmark, but on this occasion, this is actually still on the fragment piece of telegram and has been very scarce in this particular form. And I know that this particular item didn't stay very long in our stocks when it appeared. But of course, modern counterfeiting is still very much a problem which Royal Mail is battling with. Modern forgeries are very sophisticated and criminals are very good at producing them, and most of them are emanating from China. And of course, it's been quite widely reported in the media, particularly in Britain and in probably in some other sectors of the world, that the more recent Machin barcoded stamps and even the King's own stamps have been heavily faked, and of course have been infiltrating the postal system, and people have been unknowingly using them or possibly knowingly using them, and many people have been receiving a £5 fine to receive a letter bearing a counterfeit stamp. Of course, Royal Mail has changed their policy on this and has paused charging people as it looks to introduce an online scanner which customers can use to distinguish between genuine and fake stamps. I look to see the results of that one. And also, Royal Mail will now seek to return stamps to senders, informing them that the stamp used is fraudulent. So as you can see, it's a problem which hasn't gone away, and criminals, whether they be larger or smaller operations, whether they get caught or not, have always been very much playing a part in forging stamps. There is certainly money to be made, even today, with the number of letters being much smaller than it used to be. And of course, we now progress further in the talk and look at philatelic forgeries. Philatelic forgeries are not necessarily ones which you want to affix to a letter and pay for postage. They are more cunning than that. They are slightly more sophisticated and are generally sold to collectors and to dealers. Some forgeries are known as facsimiles or Falsch. Sometimes you'll see them on the back of the stamps imprinted in German saying Falsch. And some early forgeries were not actually intended as forgeries. They were produced to fill spaces in printed albums, hence the term space filler. And so these were representations of genuine stamps, but were just placed into the album just to occupy a space. Not often the stamps were quite rare or very expensive, and they just occupied the space. But over the years, they just got mixed up with normal collections. And sometimes in older time collections that I see in my day-to-day life as a philatelist, you do sometimes see these sort of facsimiles that were produced many years ago, but maybe were sold and bought as genuine because the person who was handling them may not have been able to recognize the differences. And of course, forgery doesn't just limit itself to a fake stamp from the paper up, so to speak. You can also get other forms of forgery, which by meaning, of course, are the removal of postmarks, application of fake postmarks, enhancing the stamp, altering its appearance, reperforating it, regumming it, and doing all manner of things to the stamp to enhance its desirability and sellability onto the collectors and things. And as philatelists, we are trained to spot the signs and indications of fake stamps. However, there was one gentleman who was so successful at faking stamps that his exploits are almost near legendary. And of course, I'm talking about the very famous and very talented Jean de Sperati. Sperati was the greatest stamp forger of them all, and his exploits are well documented. He is included in this part of the talk, albeit briefly, as I could never do a presentation long enough to justify his sheer talent, as he produced forgeries for sale to collectors across Europe as imitations, or as he termed them, philatelic works of art. Albeit his forgeries were so good, many of them actually contained guarantees, or had guarantees, from experts all across the philatelic world. So you can see how dangerous these forgeries were when they were even fooling the experts in the 1940s. And Sperati was very much a genius, and there's no doubt about his talents in that sense. And he devised this revolutionary technique not only to forge the great rarities from his first forgeries that he was doing with the early issues of San Marino, going right through to very early German state stamps, Spanish stamps. He faked stamps across the British Empire. He faked the 2-shilling brown, and he also faked stamps from America. Some of those ones from America are extremely good and sell quite often for even more than the genuine examples of the stamps that he was forging. His most revolutionary technique, because he had great knowledge and experience with photography and chemicals, and he was a chemist as well, and I believe a relative of his was something to do with photography. His technique would be he would take a real stamp, generally a one of no major value, bleach off the printed design, so then you had a blank sheet of paper, a genuine piece of paper that was been perforated and had a genuine watermark on the inside of the paper, and often leaving the postmark intact. He would then overprint that with his forged design, and therefore the design was actually underneath the postmark. Such skill in doing that, you could only quite marvel at it. And it wasn't until many years later that people had begun to work out how he managed to do it. But even now, replicating that would be very difficult. It seems his skill and energy sadly died with him. And this is an example, which is on the next slide here, of a Bahamas stamp. Now, it's a Sperati special. It's one that he has faked. So it is a genuine stamp with genuine watermark, but the impression of the Bahamas £1 is completely fake. The impression overall, it does look very convincing. The postmark is genuine, the paper is genuine, the perforation is the same, but the impression is fake. You can see how dangerous these were. And of course, Sperati only got caught out in the 1940s when he tried to send some stamps to a customer of his in Portugal, but got caught by French customs in 1942 and for failing to declare that he was importing and exporting capital assets. And of course, when they discovered that he had a whole box full of stamps, they called in the experts and of course, they all certified them as genuine. Sperati fought them tooth and nail over the course of some years to actually prove to them that they were fake. Now, Sperati, if anything, was also a great publicist. He became, his interest in his forgeries grew, particularly after the war and the trial, and that thusly ensuring his legacy. And of course, he was then reached out to by the British Philatelic Association, or many of the viewers here may know them simply as the BPA, who are an expertising body, and still expertising stamps today. They reached out to him in the early 1950s and published his life's work and bought his entire archive, and they spent a long time building up a resource reference work so that people who had this reference work could be able to tell the telltale signs between the genuine stamps and the Sperati fakes. And it's one I've used many times, and it's a well-thumbed book in our library, the Sperati plates, and it's a fascinating read. If anyone gets a chance to have a look at it, please do. I'm sure some philatelic societies and libraries may have a copy. But now, so we got to look at a very successful stamp forger, one who did evade justice, but was very clever in doing so. But let's talk about one who didn't quite evade justice, but his forgeries were nonetheless cunning. Let us travel back in time to the Edwardian era. So this is 30 years before sparity really came to prominence. And we encounter a gentleman called George Loudon. And George Loudon was a stamp dealer, predominantly handling Great Britain and the British Commonwealth, and he was dealing off Villiers Street, which is near Embankment Station, and indeed near us on the Strand in London. And he was also a stamp forger, and he had been caught stamp forging prior to that. He had been forging North Borneo and Orange Free State stamps. But his pièce de résistance, as it were, was his Edward VII £1 green. But why forge this particular stamp, other than it being the top value at the time? Well, the £1 stamp was primarily used for the receipt of excise duties on the import of tobacco, with the entry point being conveniently placed in the Channel Islands. Many collectors will know that late Victorian, Edward VII, and indeed George V high values, particularly the 10 shillings and the pounds, nearly always come with Guernsey or Jersey postmarks. They denote that they have been used to pay the imports on these goods. George Loudon, of course, was recognizing of the fact of this stamp because there was great demand for it from collectors at the time, and genuinely used £1 Edward VII stamps were priced in the old Stanley Gibbons catalogue at 18 shillings and sixpence at the time, which was almost face value for a stamp, which one could quite easily go to a general post office and buy one, but was still out of reach for the vast majority of collectors. After all, 18 shillings was a fair bit of money. The stamp was in such demand that it was therefore an obvious choice to Loudon to fake. In 1913, he produced a very convincing fake of the stamp, produced by photolithography, and he line perforated it and usually affixed the stamp to a plain piece of brown paper and then applied it with a forged Channel Islands postmark. As with any great Agatha Christie detective novel, we have all the key ingredients here to make a thrilling criminal crime story. We have motive, of course, the financial gain in selling his forgeries on. Secondly, we have means. Loudon was a seasoned forger, as we said, and had access to such technology to print fakes. And then, of course, then lastly, we have opportunity. He had the opportunity to fake them, and therefore he did, and he had the opportunity to make a great deal of amount of money. And Loudon was primed to sell his fakes on to unsuspecting collectors and dealers. However, I think his own greed in this occasion was his undoing. So on this next slide here, we can show you the Loudon forgery. Again, this is an example that appeared in a sale recently. And then we've got a genuine Edward VII stamp next to it there. And as you can see, it is quite a good convincing fake. Though the overall impression isn't necessarily as fine as what De La Rue produced in the genuine stamp, but they both have Channel Islands postmarks, and probably in not so brilliant lighting, particularly gas lighting, which is what most people had at that time, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Loudon contacted a local dealer, and he sold him a sackful of his Loudon forgeries. Now, when people think of a sackful, it probably was a big sackful, so there probably were many hundreds in the sack. And he charged the dealer, bearing in mind the catalogue price was 18 shillings and sixpence, he charged him 7 shillings and ninepence each. A bargain price for such a stamp, and something that was too good to be true. The dealer happily paid the man, and it was only when the unsuspecting dealer examined the stamps in better light that he discovered that they were in fact forgeries. And of course, he was not quite happy about that. Another aspect which I didn't speak about, which I will speak about now briefly on the overall design of the Loudon forgeries, is that some of them had the watermark impressed upon them, rather than being embedded in the paper as it normally is, because a watermark is made when the paper is made, so therefore it is an area that is usually on paper molds. They're a big wire frame with a metal or a wooden sort of ridge around the edge to stop the paper fibers falling out when they were placed in the vat. And the vat was filled with water and paper fibers, usually cotton or wood, and then the watermark itself was actually made of wire and sewn on using silk threads to the surface of the mold. So someone, if you are familiar with stamp watermarks, you've got there at the time you had the Imperial Crown watermark and all the other various ones that were used, watermark CC, CA. Someone had to spend all day sewing those onto the surfaces of the mold. And of course, you cannot replicate that unless you had that technology to do that. And so Loudon just simply imprinted it onto the design of the stamp. And it can actually wash away if you try to remove them off from the brown backing paper you often find them on. So we always do advise collectors to just leave them as they are. The unlucky dealer, after discovering all this and all the problems with all his stamps, contacted the police. Loudon was arrested, and after a trial at the Old Bailey, where he was convicted and sentenced to 3 years at His Majesty's pleasure for stamp forgery. Whilst Loudon's actions were indeed criminal, his intentions were to sell the stamps to collectors and dealers rather than to use the stamps for himself for postal purposes, though I should imagine a pound stamp would have been far beyond the capabilities of what he would have needed to have used them to post. His forgeries are quite scarce, as probably the survival rate isn't necessarily huge, even though only one dealer bought them. I should imagine that some have been lost to time and things, but they do occasionally sell on the market, and they generally sell for some hundreds of pounds, which is around about the same as what it would cost to buy a decent used one, mint being much higher priced. And of course, we touched upon this earlier. Forgery in a philatelic aspect is not limited to faking a stamp from the very beginning, the paper up, so to speak. Forgery in stamps can be achieved by enhancing the stamp to improve its appearance, apply a fake cancellation or overprint, or to pass it off as a mint example by re-gumming it. Much of this topic has already been discussed, and I wouldn't want to bore my audience any further by talking about that, but I'd like to guide them to a video that was done by a colleague of mine, George Dames. He did a presentation on fakery and forgery from items from our Stanley Gibbons reference collection, and that video is available on our YouTube channel, and it was also one that he's given at Virtual Stampex, and it's a talk he's also given at Stampex when it's been held in person in London. And this video, along with many others, including some which you may have seen a very familiar presenter, can also be found in the YouTube channel as well. For my section on forged stamps, I'm also going to show you an item from our reference collection, and we're going to play a little game of, can you tell me which is the fake and how has it been faked? For this particular stamp, we're going to look at two classic stamps. We're going to look at a penny black and a tuppenny blue. And here are the two stamps. We have a penny black and a tuppenny blue. But all is not as it seems. You might be thinking to yourself, but Oscar, these look absolutely fine to me. How can these be wrong at all? Well, looks are deceiving, and all is not as it seems. The penny black on the left is actually a penny red, but it's been chemically altered to resemble a penny black. And if you look upon it in a much closer way, an almost microscopic level, you can actually still see parts of the red ink, which have just been colored in over the years. Another telltale sign is the overall color and appearance. It's quite off. It doesn't quite look like it. Neither does it have any of the characteristics of a penny black plate, because the penny red was just a random penny red. It's not a penny red that was printed from a black plate, and neither is it from one of the 11 plates that we use to print penny blacks with. And also, and that probably the more astute of you may notice, that the postmark is completely wrong. That numeral postmark, number 498, which I believe is from Manchester, didn't come into use until years after the penny black was issued. In fact, 4 or 5 years afterwards. So again, it's impossible. It's completely impossible. But it's still a very good and convincing fake. And someone was caught out by that. So much so that we took the time to include it in our reference collection so that it could never be placed back onto the open market. Now, you're all probably wondering, wow, we've got to be really suspicious now about this tuppenny blue. Is that been coloured in as well? No. Its enhancement is a lot more cruder, but nonetheless effective. The tuppenny blue is, believe it or not, a tuppenny blue. It's completely fine, but it's the wrong tuppenny blue. It is an 1841 tuppenny blue. Now, the 1841 tuppenny blue had white lines added underneath postage and above 2p, and someone has very cleverly just painted over those white lines. Again, someone got caught out by this and bought the stamp. But apart from the fact that the white lines are been sort of coloured in and coloured over, that it is still technically a tuppenny blue, but it's just the wrong tuppenny blue. But even still, whilst these forgeries are not necessarily as sophisticated as what Sperati was doing, they are still nonetheless dangerous and could easily fool someone when purchasing them. And these stamps wouldn't have been sold as prime examples of those stamps. They would have been sold as collectible examples, probably at a really good discounted price as well. So again, further enhancements towards people. So again, they're sold for the philatelic market and for financial gain, but they're also designed to fool people, and fooling people is going to be the next part of the talk, where we look at the world of propaganda forgeries. Propaganda is a tool which has been used by governments in war and peacetime for thousands of years, and stamps easily lend themselves to forgery and to propaganda purposes as well. They are tools of propaganda. They display an image, a bias, which can be seen all across the world. Stamps, whilst a device of proving the payment of postage, are not just confined to the post office. They have their part to play on the battlefield. They are weapons of psychological warfare, parachuting in to demoralize the enemy and damage confidence in the enemy's postal service and cause discontent to disrupt normal and everyday life. During the Second World War, the Allies and the Nazis were both actively forging each other's documents, banknotes, passports, food coupons, ration books, all with the intent of damaging the other side. Late in the summer of 1943, stamps produced by the Allies were parachuted into Germany, but they were not depicting Hitler. They were depicting Himmler. So in the place of the Führer's head, they depicted Himmler, who was in charge of the Gestapo and in charge of the SS. These forgeries began to appear in the everyday sort of system, with the idea that people would see them over breakfast, hence why the British named this Operation Cornflakes. But other people have already done videos on Operation Cornflakes, but they haven't done videos or talks on what the reaction and the response was to Operation Cornflakes that the Nazis did. The Gestapo located these stamps and forwarded them on to Berlin. On arrival in Berlin, Himmler and the Nazi state were insulted and appalled by these, and orders were given to launch a counterstrike against England by printing their own forgeries. Whilst this is not a groundbreaking or original suggestion, the forgeries which they produced are rather fascinating. Himmler commissioned reproductions of the current King George VI stamps and commemoratives to be faked. Strict criterion was made that the stamp should be as close as possible to the original specimens, with no alterations to the king's profile or issued colours. Also, that communist symbols and other imagery would be inserted in and incorporated in design, overprints being the liquidation of empire issues, which we'll touch on in a minute. And lastly, that the fakes were to be printed and produced and distributed to Allied areas within 6 to 8 weeks. The fakes were produced in offset lithography from photographs taken of the genuine stamps captured from the Allies, and were manufactured in the printer shop in a concentration camp. The stamps are a little larger than the issue stamp design and were printed on wavy lined watermarked paper, which was what was available to the Nazis at the time. So this slide here, which you can see, shows some of the propaganda forgeries which they produced. And as you can see, they do look on the face of it quite convincing, but there are a few telltale signs which they changed. They altered very small aspects of the design. They only issued those 5 there, the definitives being the predominant ones that they used. So they had 5 to 6 issues that they could send out, and these are the ones that were primarily used for postage purposes being the halfpenny, penny, one and halfpenny, tuppence, tuppenny, halfpenny, threepence. And we've got some examples of genuines at the bottom. You're looking at the screen now thinking, right, what's wrong with these? What are the telltale signs? Well, we'll talk to you about them. And of course, we mentioned that they had incorporated into design communist symbols. So the most obvious one is actually in the value itself. So where it says penny, which usually is by the symbol of a D, they actually replace it with a hammer and sickle. And on top of the imperial crown is, instead of topped with a cross, is actually topped with the Star of David. Again, anti-Semitism was something that was very much featured in the stamps, of course, through the whole presentation, which I'll show you in upcoming examples. But of course, they didn't just fake these, they also faked commemoratives. This is my favorite one because it just looks quite good. And this is the Silver Jubilee issue of 1935. And of course, the fake example is on the left. And that, instead of depicting the king, George V, who was celebrating his Silver Jubilee in 1935, it actually depicts Stalin, the leader of Russia at the time. And the description of the stamp, rather than saying Silver Jubilee and halfpenny, it was changed to, "This is a Jewish war," and the date was 1939 to 1944. The reason that they picked this date was that to imply that the end of the war was near for England and that England wouldn't have long to last, because the war ended in 1945. And with this particular picture here, you can see quite clearly in the margins the wavy lined watermark that was used on the particular stamps. And as you can see, apart from the obvious, the change symbols, the lettering, and Stalin's face, they are very convincing. They do look quite similar. And the next one, which is probably a further insult to Britain, is the fact that it implies that the king is married to Stalin, or maybe vice versa. And that was the 1937 coronation issue that they produced. And Stalin takes the place of George VI's consort, Queen Elizabeth, in this particular image. And in the middle there, you can see the imperial crown is again further imposed by the hammer and sickle. It also states that it's SSR Britannia, and that stands for Soviet State Russian Britannia, making out that it was simply a territory of Russia at the time. And they also replaced the King and Queen's joint cipher in the center of the stamp to further embellish it as a Russian monogram. And of course, further anti-Semitic imagery with the Star of David was further added into the stamp design. The last set of forgeries what the Nazis did were using up the remains of the stock which they had, and they overprinted them in a boxed design called Liquidation of Empire. And the Liquidation of Empire issues we touched upon earlier were designed to demoralize the British people and British troops across the empire. Now, much of the empire had been occupied by the Japanese at this point, particularly in Asia. And so the idea of these was to further demoralize the British, particularly in, say, areas of Singapore, Burma, and Hong Kong, and out into Malaya. There was a complete set of 14 colonies that they chose to depict, and they were overprinted in different colors, red and black, across in strips and panes of 6. The overprints were designed to also give the impression that the unity of the empire against the Nazi threat was fragmenting, and that the empire would crumble anytime soon. Some of these overprints are scarcer than others, particularly ones from the West Indies tend to come up quite often. It's the ones from sort of Asia that are particularly scarcer. So we've got in these scans here, we have threepence at the bottom, which is from Singapore. Next up, we have Rangoon, which is now Burma, modern-day Myanmar. We've got Borneo, Hong Kong, and then there's one at the end, which you may have never heard of before, and that's Bougainville. Bougainville is in the Pacific, and it was also an area that was under threat from the Japanese and the Germans. And originally, and if you're not too familiar with this island, it is one of the main islands forming Papua New Guinea, and was a former German territory before being acquired by the British after the First World War. Now, the last set of overprints that the Nazis did, which come into sort of 2 categories. One were known as extremes of world politics, and other ones then had other propagandic slogans. And there are some of these which are particularly rare. So the extreme worlds of politics referred to the state of the world, as it were, and again, ideating to further demoralize the British troops with communist and Stalinist slogans, further giving the idea that England was nothing but a serf to Russia at this time, an unpopular ally. And we got here world Bolshevism, world slavery, world Judaism, and the Bluff Charter. And the Bluff Charter is referring to the Atlantic Charter, which the Allies had signed before the war and was being mocked severely by the Germans at this time. These, all of these slogans were intended to be dropped on the Allies when they were storming the beaches of Normandy at the time, and these were prepared late on in the war. And the ones at the bottom are the particularly rare ones. And they read AAA 0, or AAAO, I should say. And of course, that stands for Allied Army Amphibian Operations, and then followed on by a slogan. So we have the first one here, the Tuppenny Orange, which reads, England bleeds on the order of Moscow. That's a particularly rare one. And not many of those seem to have survived. And it's quite a powerful message. And that's the next one is England has lost the war. And the last one is that on the orders of Stalin, again, giving further emphasis that England was acting in the interest of Russia and not on the interests for pertaining to keep freedom alive. Now, this particular one here is a bit of an anomaly because it is actually one that was used on a letter. It was applied to a letter after the war in 1953 and was actually addressed to a gentleman called Hosang, and Hosang is the gentleman who wrote the main and the first works on these German propaganda forgeries, and it's known as Stamps in Battle Dress, and I can recommend that piece of reference work to viewers, as it is a really good early reference work of these particular issues. But going on back to the point I was going to raise is how successful were these forgeries? Now, the forgeries were planned in Himmler's great revenge tactic as a counter-offensive were not wholly successful. Many thousands of stamps were prepared, up to 90,000 it is thought were prepared, and these were to be distributed to agents, Allied sympathetic agents in Switzerland, Turkey, and Sweden. These agents, however, upon receiving the stamps, decided that these stamps were a welcome source of revenue and sold them and sold all their stocks to a stamp dealer, making a tidy profit. Berlin was not too pleased about this and cut supplies and located other distributors. However, the end of the war was looming and their effectiveness as a weapon of war was rapidly dwindling. The remaining stocks of forgeries were stored along with other Nazi forged articles such as banknotes, passports, and other wartime paraphernalia and confidential documents were transferred into an air raid bunker before eventually being taken out of the air raid bunker and transported by lorry outside of Berlin under SS supervision. Whilst arriving in the countryside, knowing that Allied troops were close, and they were given orders by the officer at the time to burn the stocks of stamps and all the other documents they had with them, because none of the fleeing troops wanted to save any of these documents or any of the stamps for fear of further incrimination after the war. Some of the stocks of these stamps were salvaged elsewhere and later they found their way onto the open market. And of course, hence why this particular example was also found and was then later used by the author of the reference work to send himself a letter. But as you can see, the post office, when it arrived in Germany, spotted the irregularity, probably not knowing that it was one of the very own propaganda forgeries, and taxed it accordingly. Such commercial usages of these forgeries are very rare, and I have no doubt that when this particular example comes up for sale later on in the year, along with all the other examples that I have shown in this presentation, will probably sell for a fair amount of good prices. These forgeries, whilst not very successful tools of espionage, are fascinating artifacts and have been well studied by collectors since the end of the war. And if anyone has got any further questions or interest about these, again, we'll be having a sale of King George VI along with these very, very good collection of propaganda forgeries towards the end of the year. So please keep an eye on our website, or you can speak to me afterwards in the in the chat afterwards. Now, as we bring this talk to its close, I hope it's given you some insight into the stories behind the forgeries and the various reasons why one may want to fake a stamp, whether it be criminal, philatelic, or for propaganda purposes. Forgeries are, on the one hand, very dangerous and are designed to deceive, but they are also very fascinating to us collectors, and we have to be wary about this fascination. It's almost as if we're playing with fire, but we quite like to get our tweezers burnt on this occasion. Many of them can be admired as great skills and works of art, and it takes enormous talent to make a very good fake, as we've seen with Sperati's fakes. And there are other fakes that would produce, such as Spyro forgeries and other sort of forms of crude lithographic forgeries, which are decent representations, but are often crude, and you can spot them a mile off in some respects. And we have also seen how examples of genuine stamps have been altered and enhanced as another method of fakery, to pass off a stamp as another, or to otherwise improve it and increase its sellability and desirability to collectors. And lastly, we examined stamps as weapons of war, tools of propaganda, and how effective they were as espionage tactic and demoralizing the enemy. And I hope that you have enjoyed this talk, and for the ones who've stayed from the very beginning to the very end, I thank you. And I would also like to thank the organizers of Virtual Stampex for inviting me.